So in the last sessions, we discussed about object-oriented programming concepts, and we understood what is a class, what is an object, and we have seen multiple examples on that. So, okay. Now in this session, we'll discuss more about methods. So what are methods? So if you remember, we discussed methods while we were defining the class. So a class is a collection of variables and methods, or we can call it as properties, attributes, data members, anything, right? So anything is same, all are synonyms. So a class is a collection of variables and methods, right? So we are going to focus mostly on methods in this session. So what are methods? A method is a block of code which will perform certain tasks, and we can call the method using the object. So this is what we have learned when we learned about what is a class and how do we create an object for the class and use that object to call the methods defined within it within a class, right? So a method is a block of code which will perform certain task. This is what we have learned, right? And we also know how to call this method. So whenever we wanted to call this method, why do we need to call this method? So a method contains a block of code which will perform certain tasks. And when we wanted to actually have this task to be performed, then we definitely need to we can make use of calling this method. So we call this method, and as the method is inside the class, so whenever a variable or a method which are inside the class, then we can access them by creating the object for that class. So once we have an object for that class, then we can call the methods in it, or also can access the variables within the class. So a method can be accessed using the object, right? Can call using object. The class in which defined. So this is a method. There are different types of methods. We'll see those types now. So a method can take no parameters and can return no value. So a method can take no parameters and can return no value. And in the same way, a method can take no parameters, meaning the method will not take any parameters, but it will return some value. And a method can take parameters and will not return value. A method can take parameters and will return value. So these are the different types, or we can say combinations of methods we do have. So now let us understand each with an example. Let me create a package for today. I'll call this as day 11. And we'll create a class. I'll call this as method types. So first we'll see no params, no return value. So how do we define a method inside a class? We have seen, right? So we don't, this we don't even need main method. We'll have main method in a different class. So as we learn now classes and objects, we'll have a different class to have a main method. So for now, like we'll define only methods within the class. All right. So this is our class, and we wanted to define the methods within it. Now I'll call a method called I have a method called m1, right? So is this a valid syntax? No. So when we define a method, we have to specify a return type. Return type. So if the method doesn't have any return type in the sense a method will execute some statements. So it is defined to have some block of code to be executed so that something will be achieved, right? So that's the definition of method we have learned. So inside it, it can have one or more statements. Now, so this method has two main properties, like it can accept some parameters within it. So a method, how we define method name and then braces followed by close, open brace and close brace, right? Within this, we can take the parameters. Parameters in the sense, some again variables in which can accept. While calling this method, we can pass some data to this method that will be captured within this parameters. Within this variables, you can say it looks like the variables, but we call it as parameters when we in the point of view of a method, right? So in this case, like this method is not accepting any parameters, and it is not returning any value. Returning in the sense, once a block of code is executed, at the end of the method, we can return some value. So this return can be, this return type can be anything, like I can return an integer value. We can, return some string. You can return a char, like this, end of the method. So, and we can remember, we can return only one value. We can always return at the end of the method, we can only return one value, right? So in this case, we don't even have any return value for this method. So this is optional. Either we can return the value at the end of the method or not. But when you are not returning a value, then we have to specify that a keyword called void. We even discussed this in the last session, if you remember. So a keyword called void, so which says that this method doesn't return anything. So it just had some block of code inside it. It is gonna execute only that, but it is not going to return any value, is what that means, right? So you can just say welcome. So if you see, this is a method which is taking no parameters. Parameters in the sense this close brace, this open brace and close brace, right? Method name, this brackets, and then as the method is not returning any value, we should mention void. Void in the sense, like method is not returning anything, is what we are specifying using this keyword called void. If it is going to return anything, we can specify that here. This is return type. We call it this as return type, right? So this is and this whole part, like return type, method name, and parameter section. All these we call it as a signature, method signature. Right? So this is about the a method which doesn't accept any parameters and also doesn't return anything. Right? So let's create a new class. We will call this as main, just to have main method. We'll have a different class. You just need to drag. You just need to select this class and drag it down a bit, then the second screen will form, like the next class adjacent to it will connect to the right side of the present class. All right. So now we have a main method. We have a main method for this method, right? Method types. Now we wanted to, how do we call this method? Definitely we have to create a object for this, right? So let's create an object for method types. So method types is in a different class, right? It's not there within the class. So do we need to import this? Import the definition for this class method types? No, because it's also in the same package. If it is in the same package, we don't need to import the definition for it. GVM implicitly, it can understand that this is the class which might be present in the same package, and it will use the definition from the same package if the class exists in the package, right? So now we created an object for the class. And why do we create the object? We wanted to call the method called M1. That's it. So if you try to right click on the class which you have the method and try to run it, you'll not find run as Java application because you don't have main method here. Whereas in the second class on to the right, you have the main method and you can see run as Java application. So let's run this and you can see welcome here, right? So this is all about a method accepting no parameters and returning no value, right? So now let us see second type. Second type is it takes no parameters but returns value. Just a small difference. It, take, it takes no parameter. So this will not change, but it is gonna return something. You can return like this also. But as it is returning something, we need to specify its return type. What's the return type of this? What we are returning here? We are not returning an integer or a char value, right? So we are returning a string. So we have to specify that just before the method name, string, right? So this completes the syntax for this method. So it is taking no parameters, but it is returning something. So we have to specify what it is returning. It is returning string is what we need to mention it to this method. So we do that just before the method name. So this we call it as a return type. And observe that this method is also not taking any parameters, right? So this is what we call it as no params return value. So let's call this method to empty dot m2. So if you observe, we don't get anything like in the console. This is because if you what's the difference between the earlier method and this method is the earlier method it was not returning any value, right? But this method was returning some value. So it as it is returning this value, this m2, when we call this m2 method, it was returning some value. So if it returns some value, then we have to capture it. We have to capture it into some string, right? So let's capture that. See, for example, and then whatever has been captured, we can print it here. Now we can actually display this value. So what happened here? When we called this m2 method, it was called, right? Even the value has been written, but that has to be captured, right? So that has to be captured in a data type, which it is matches the return type of the method, right? So the method is returning string. So we can capture whatever we can call this, and something will be returned. That something will be string here, as you can notice the return type of this method. So that return type of object we have to declare and have the return value assigned to it, right? So that return value, anyway, we can, whatever you wanted to do, like in your logic, you can use that, right? We are just printing it on the console. So whenever we are returning value, we can capture that in an object, right? Or what we can do is in an object and then we can use it. Or what we can do is we can directly display it. Like say for example, this is very much equivalent to this, right? So str is equal to empty.m2 anyway. You can see that here. So instead of assigning this value into some other object and then using that object, you can directly call this and use this wherever you want it. But the practice is like the best practice is to have it assigned to a variable or object and then use it, because multiple times you don't need to call this method, right? So the value will be readily available in an object or a variable. So even this is valid. Yeah, you can see the output, right? So what did we do? We instead of calling this method, we directly instead of capturing the result or the return value of the method, we can directly call the method wherever we wanted, like this, right? Even this is valid. So this is all about a method taking no parameters, accepting no parameters, but returning a value, right? So now let us see other type. Next type is a method takes no parameters. A method takes no parameters and returns no value. So a method takes no parameters, but returns takes parameters, but returns nothing. So let's call this method as m3. What we wanted to do, we wanted to take an input string. You can take some name, and then it is returning nothing. So whenever a method is returning nothing, what do we need to specify return type as? Void. We definitely need to specify void, as it is gonna return nothing. As we know, it is not going to return anything. Then we need to specify it as void. So we should not leave it as if. We should not leave it empty as it is not returning anything, right? So we have to specify void, which says that the method is returning nothing, right? So now here we can accept this parameter. So while calling this method, we can pass some data to this parameter. So when we pass some data, that will be copied into this object or variable, and this we can use it inside the logic of our method. Say for example, we can say hi, like this, right? And then what we can do, we can call this using the object m2.m3. Now observe, earlier what we used to do, we used to directly call the method, because earlier there was the methods used to take no parameters. But this m3 method is taking a parameter, it will accept a parameter. So you need to definitely pass a parameter or data which matches the data type of this parameter, which method m3 is accepting, right? So if you do not pass anything, then that becomes incorrect syntax. It will throw an error. It says the method m3 of string in the type method types is not applicable for the arguments, which means that so you have defined a method m3 which accepts string, but you're not passing any arguments, is what it is saying. You can even see the suggestion. You can even see the fix, right? Add argument to match m3 is the suggestion, right? So we definitely need to add a pass a parameter, some data here. So it could be even an empty string, but we can pass something like this. Even it's a string, right? We can pass something like this. Yeah, you can see the output, right? So if you see, it is a what happened here was when we called this method using the object of this class m3, then the data which we are passing to this method has been passed to here, right? So it has been passed there, and then it has been copied literally, like so. When we called it, this method was called, and this value has been copied here. Now this method has to be executed, right? So control enters into this method, and it tries to execute the statements within this method. And what are the statements we have? We have written I, and then concatenation. Plus is used here as concatenation, and then name. So what do we have the value as name here? So this value has been copied here, right? So that value will be displayed here, right? So this is the value. So it will be copied and it will be displayed. So this is the use of parameters. So the methods, when it accepts the parameters, so we can use those parameters inside the logic of the method, right? So inside the method, we can use it to write the logic. So like this, we can have n number of parameters sent to the method. So the only thing is it has to match with the method signature. So once we define the method signature, that is taking one parameter or more parameters for the method, then while calling those method, we need to pass the data which matches with the number of arguments of the method and also the data type of the method. So we'll see more on this in the next session when we are discussing about method overloading. But for now, you can think it of like when we define a method which accepts parameters, we need to pass the matching data to the method, right? Matching data in the sense data type, which matches the data type of the method parameters, right? So this is all about a method taking parameters, accepting parameters, but returning nothing. If you observe, it is returning nothing. It is just printing something, and even this is optional. You can write any other statements as well, but it is returning nothing. So we have to observe that as it is returning nothing, as the method is returning nothing, we need to specify the return type as void. If it was returning something else, then we would have specified the return type of that data type. Say, for example, return 10, then integer, return some 50.45, then we would have made it double like that. If it is returning string, we would have made the return type as string like that. So on, right? So this is about taking parameters, a method taking parameters and returning nothing. Now we'll see in the last type, which takes parameters and also returns value. M4 method takes parameters and also returns some value. So you can take the same example of above. So for example, it accepts name and it is also should return some, let's say for example, some string, right? So why do we are getting error here? If you see, this method must return a result of type string because you have specified what its return type is, but you are not returning anything. That's the error it is saying. So let's return something here. So we can return something like this. So M4, and then we are returning something here, right? It is taking string as a parameter and it's also returning string, right? So it did not be like that. It can accept integer, it can return string. It can accept string, it can return integer. All the combinations are also valid. So for now, what did we do? We are taking string as an input in the sense like string as a parameter, accepting string as a parameter, and also returning string as a return type, right? So now you can see. So say for example, I have some name here. So if you see, whenever it is returning something, just calling the method does nothing, right? So as we don't have any system.out.println in this method, right? So if you want, you can do that as well. But as the method is returning something, we need to capture that. Again, this is optional, but if you wanted to capture that, so you can capture that into an object. So you see, M4 is returning string. So here we can capture that into a string. And we can display that on the console. So if you see, it just says hi Smith because what happened here, like again, in like same as the previous example, what happened here was like when we call m2 empty.m4, m4 method has been called and this value has been copied here, right? So, and when this method enters into the block of code to be executed, so it just sees return and then hi and then concatenated y plus name. Whatever value you have in name will be replaced with this name here. And then that whole string, this whole string has been formed by some name of the value. This whole string is written finally, right? It's not displaying here, right? So it has been written here. So now the whole string which has been formed and written. So why it is written? So the return type is string we specified, right? So we are returning string now. So that string, so we'll get that string here with the call of this method. So that return value will be assigned to this str string. So that is what we are trying to display on the console and verify here, right? So this is how we can actually pass the parameters, or the method can take the parameters and return the value. So whenever a method is taking parameters, so we can pass here one or more parameters. It did not be only one parameter. We can accept, you can pass more parameters as well. For example, let me show you another example. Say for example, I can pass something like this. So you can say like this as well. Now, how do we define it? We need to pass two parameters. How do we pass it? So empty dot m5. So now see, it accepts two parameters. So we need to specify two parameters here. We are passing two parameters here to m5 because m5 has been defined to accept two parameters. So if you observe, it is taking one string, one integer, right? So and it is returning the value here. So but again, like even though we are using this integer, the whole thing return value is a string if you observe, right? So we can capture this into a string, or we can directly use this in the system.out.println. We can even do it something like this. So if you want, we can even call it like this, empty dot m5, and then it can take some value here. So you can say see here, right? So okay, we're seeing about this method. Okay. So if you see empty dot m5, what it does, it is passing two parameters, name, string, and an integer, David and 25. So this will be copied here into this parameter, and that values will be written inside the method. So you can see hi, and name has been copied. It is getting it from the call. So David, your age is, so age, whatever age he is, 25, right? So your age is 25. So that has to be displayed. We can see that now. So the whole string has been written, and that is captured into str here, right? And then that is displayed here, right? So this is how you can actually pass the parameters to a method and also capture the return value into an object or a variable, right? So you can simply write this two statements in one statement like this. You don't need to capture that into a separate object. Instead, we can call the method directly. This is also same as the earlier one, right? So it just passes two parameters to the method, and whatever has been captured or whatever has been written, so that we are going to display it in the system.out.println, that is on the console, right? So this is all about the method types. So there are four method types. So we can see which accepts, like these are all the combinations, right? Combinations of the methods we have seen, and each with an example. So whatever we have seen here, like the parameters, we might have seen only string, but you can think it of like the parameters can be of any data type and can return in any return type data, right? So, and remember, the method can only return one value at a time, right? And, except like in a special case where we can return an array, but still that's an object. So it can return, a method can return only one object is what we can say. So array also becomes one object. So we can say that a method can only always return one value. And a method can actually, it's an optional to return some data. If it is not returning anything, any data, then the method, then we need to specify void for the method. And taking parameters for the method is optional. It can accept the parameters, or it it need not, right? It's not mandatory. It's an optional thing. So these are all about the methods and method types. Is that clear? Any questions? All right. So hope it is clear. Okay. So we can go to the next topic then. Now, what are the examples of this? So Say for example, I had something like this. String is equal to selenium. So if I see, say we have learned this string methods, right? So string is equal to selenium. I am doing s.trim. Say for example, I have had some spaces and I wanted to trim it. So this is what trim method does, right? It actually removes the trailing and leading spaces in the string. So which type this method comes under? So S is an object of string class, and we can call the methods within the string class, right? String is a built-in class. We have seen different types of methods, right? So trim is one of the method we have seen even, right? So I'm saying s.trim now. So under which type this method comes? So we do have four types of methods defined here, right? We just learned. So under which type this method comes under? Any guesses? So it comes under the first method type. It is taking no parameters if you observe. And s.trim doesn't even return any value. It will not return any value, right? So it just trims the trailing and leading spaces. So it comes under no params, no return value. No param, no return value. Okay. Now, uh, let me give you another example. I'll just say length. And it is captured into some variable like this. So under which type this method comes? L.length returns length of the string, right? So if you see here, if you closely observe, so what happens here? So see, it is accepting no parameters, but still it is returning some value, right? So this comes under second type. And for example, I can use substring method, which can accept parameters like this, right? And substring actually returns some string, right? So under which type this method comes under? S.substring, right? It is accepting parameters and it is also returning value. So it comes under the last type. So these are the examples which we know, which we learned, right? There could be more examples, and in the coming sessions, you can actually identify the methods which actually takes parameters and which returns value in all these combinations, right? So for now, these are the examples which we already know, right? Now we will see how many ways we can actually pass data into the variables. So till now, what did we learn? So we define some variables in the class, and from the main method, we pass data to those variables in the class using the object of the class. That we call it as object reference variable. So using the object reference variable, like we pass the data to the data members or variables of the class, right? So this we have learned. Now we will see all the different ways how we can pass the data into the variables. So for that, let me create a new class. I'll call my class as from employee. I'll not take the main method. Employee might have employee ID, string, employee name, and say for example, self. So I'm defining a class called employee and having some variables within it, right? So first we declare variables, right? And then methods, right? So methods, I will just say, I wanted to display employee data. And this method is not returning anything. I know this, I'm not going to return anything within this method. So I'm going to write the return type as void. Need to specify the return type as void. So because this method is not going to return anything, I know that. So we can just say void within it. So I wanted to actually display something, that is the values of these variables. This we have seen in the last session as well. We can do it in one line, or also you can divide this like in different lines also. So say for example, this is employee ID, right? You can have it something like this. This is employee ID, employee name, salary. Right? What did we do here? We had some variables within a class called employees, and we are defining a method which displays the employee data, and we wanted to display these details, right? So display the details, we actually use these variables within the method, right? All right, now what we can do is we will have another method. We will have another method, or for now, what we'll do is first let's understand it here, right? So some variables have been declared and we had a method. This we know. We learned already. So now we'll create another class. I'll call this class as employee main, and we'll take a main method where we are going to define the main method, right? All right. So I'm going to create an object for employee. I'll call this as employee one. So we just created an object for the employee now, right? So E1 is an object of employee class. Now, how do we call this method? So we can directly call E1 dot display employee, but we have to pass the data for this first, right? So using the object reference, so new employee actually creates an object in the memory. We know that, right? New actually creates a new object, and object of employee class is what we are mentioning here, right? So this is creating an object in the memory, and it returns the object reference. So that object reference we are capturing in E1, which is of employee type, right? So that is what we are calling it as simply object of employee class. It's actually a reference to the object, right? So using that reference, we are actually calling the members within it, E1 dot EID. So I can say something like this, and then E1 dot ename. We are just passing some values here to the variables, right? Now we pass the values to the variables using the object. So E1 is an object now, which actually passes this values, right? Now E1 dot method name. What's the method name? Display employee data. So when we call this method, so control enters here and it will try to display these values, right? So it already has these values. If you observe, this object has the values here, right? Set into these variables. So the same object is calling the method. So it will have that those values in it, right? So it should actually display these details. So let us verify this. Yeah. So you can say employee ID, name, salary, right? So, and it displays the details as expected, right? So this is all we know even, right? So this we call it as passing data using object reference variable. So we are passing data using object reference variable here, right? So this we already know. This is one way using object reference variable. Now we can even define this is object reference variable, right? So we can even define a method. This is user defined method where we can pass the data to the variables. So how do you do that? We can actually create a method. Say for example, set emp data. Whatever we have just learned, so that we can use it now. So how do we pass the data is we are going to take it as accept it as a parameter. Int id name. We can just say pay. So this is a user defined method. We are defining this method to accept some parameters, right? So, and then we need to set these values. So the values will, when we call this method, these parameters is gonna accept those values, but those values has to be used, right? So where are we going to use? So we are interested to pass this data to the class variables. So observe the difference carefully here. And why it is throwing error? So it is saying return type of the method is missing. So it is very clear, right? We did not specify the return type. We are just assigning the values to the variables, but we are not returning anything. So the return type would be void here. So what did we do here? We wanted to pass the data to this method, right? So we have actually defined some parameters and we gave some method name, set employee data, and which is not returning anything. So this is the reason we specified void. All right. Till here it is fine, right? We know. And it is actually takes the parameters. And we have to use those parameters. So this is the reason what we did. We actually assign this ID to the employee ID. So on the left are the instance variables. Instance variables are the class variables. Whatever are the variables of the class, those are on the left, if you observe. On the right are the parameters, which actually got the values from the method call, right? So you should not get confused. So even we can have these names, right? So for now, I have used the different names, but even we can have these names also same as the class variables and assign it. But you should not get confused with this parameter values and the class variables. Parameter values are the temporary ones, which holds the value whatever the method calls. So a method can call with different values, right? So those values are temporary and are held by these parameters temporarily for that call, only for that method call, right? And this we can use it uh, in whatever way we wanted, right? What we did was taking those values, we initialize those values to the class members. We actually assign those values to the class members. Class members are different again, right? Class members or class variables are the variables defined within the class, right? So once they are defined, once they are assigned or once they get the values, this we can use it in any other method again, right? So let's actually try this. So we have seen this method, right? So this was one type, the first one using the object reference variable, the first one, right? This was using object reference variable. Now we are going to see using methods. Using user-defined methods. Even is the object, fine. Even dot. Now observe, set emp data, and then we'll pass some data to it. Second parameter is string, right? So it can be some string, and then it can actually accept some value here as the salary, right? So with this call, what happens? So we are calling a method set emp data here. So what happens here is when we call this method, these values are passed like this. 102 is passed to ID, Robert will be passed to name, and this value, whatever is there, has been passed to pay. And this method gets executed. What's the logic within that method? So these values again, ID, which is actually this value, has been assigned to this value, class variable, right? E-name, salary. So whatever class variables are there, we are assigning those to this variables, right? So you'll get it, like why we are doing this, right? So why we are doing this? We are actually passing the data to the class variables. So that we can do using object reference variable one time. We have seen that. So using the object, we are directly able to access the class members, and then we are able to pass the data. Now we wanted to see how we can pass the data in a different way using the user defined method. That is what we are trying now. This is the reason we created one separate method, one separate user defined method, which accepts the parameters. So as this method is accepting parameters, three parameters, we are passing data to this method. So on the method call, what happens is this data gets copied to the parameters of this method, and we can use these parameter values inside the method. Inside the method, how we are using is, like we are passing this data to the class variables, the respective class variables within the method, right? So within the method, we don't need to call it as a object dot class variable name, right? So this method understands that these are these are the variables which are there in the same class which I am, is what this can understand, this method can understand, right? So that is the reason we are not using any objects to access this class members, right? So we are directly able to access this class members as both class variables and these methods are in the same class, right? So, and what did we do here? After passing these parameter values here, so we are using these values to have it assigned to the class variables, right? So now class variables have the data. And from here, it will be same. Once we get the data, we can use it in any other method. So we are gonna call the display MP data now. Then anyway, this EAD, ename, sal already has the data, right? Now it holds the data. Then these details will be displayed. So that's how this method of, passing the parameters using the method works. Yeah, you can see now, right? It displays the data as expected, right? So what did we do here? We are actually passing the information or data using some user defined method. So we had intentionally created a method which takes the parameters. So three different parameters if you observe, and passing the data to that method. So once we pass this method, call this method, so calling the method, what we are doing indirectly, we are actually passing the data to this method. So that data, we have written a logic to have it. You can use it in any way, this data, right? But what we did was, like, we assigned these values to the class variables so that these class variables will have some value in it and can be used in any other method inside the class, right? So that is what we did. So this is how you can actually pass the data to the parameters of the user defined method. And this is the actual way. So we wanted to actually see the different way to pass the data, right? To the class variables. So this is a second method using user defined method, right? So the first method was using object reference variable. The second one was like creating a user defined method. No, the third type. It's a new one. So using constructor. Using constructor. So what is a constructor? So now observe carefully. This is very important. So what's a constructor? Constructor is also same as a method, same as a user defined method. But constructor will always have the name as same as the class name, right? So if you see here, I've created a method with the same as the class name. Class name is employee. Again, I'm creating a method within the class with the same name, right? So this we call it as a constructor. So this we call it as a constructor, right? So constructor is also like a normal method, but the name of it will be same as the class name. So that's first point. And this constructor, as we said, it is same as method, any method, any user defined method. So it differs in a return type. So it will not have the return type. So this constructor will not have the return type. It's like a normal method. The first point we need to remember is, but it will have the, you can't actually have a different name to it. It will definitely have, the constructor will definitely have the name same as the class name. Second point is, it doesn't return any value. Constructor will not return any value. We will see this, why it is so, right? So in few minutes. But for now, just you have to know that constructor is also like a another any method, but it will have the name same as the class name, and it will not return. It will not have the return type. Not have the return type in the sense we specify void, right? You don't even need to specify void, as it doesn't return any value, right? So ever, so we don't need to even specify the return type as void, because if you want to specify void, you'll need to specify void every time, right? So that that's useless, right? So that's not useful for us. So we anyway know it is not gonna return any value. So even void is omitted here. You don't even need to specify void for the constructor, because it is implicit that constructors will not return value, and constructor will have a method name same as the class name. So these are the two main characteristics we need to remember, right? So now, how do you make use of this constructor? Same as in the above example, like how we did for the method set emp data. In the same way, like we can pass the data to it. So yeah, same way, like you can just even copy paste it like this. It will take these parameters, and then we can assign the values to it. Because we are calling even this, even though it is a constructor we are calling, it is same like any other method. Only thing is the method name, we can't have our own name or custom name, like set emp data I have defined, right? So you can define it as set employee data like that. So we can have any name, but constructor will have the method name same as the class name, and constructor will not return value. So it will not have any return type. So not even void, right? And inside, so other things are same, like it can accept parameters or it can have take no parameters, right? And we can use those parameters inside the constructor for any purpose. But usually we use constructor to initialize the class variables. Initialize the class variables. We usually use constructor to initialize the class variables. Any other user-defined method can have any other logic, but usually constructors are defined to initialize the class variables, right? So now we do have a constructor. So how do we call it? Again, it's like a normal call, like how we call a method, right? So like a method, we can call it. But if you see here, so how the variables, how the constructor is invoked is, so if you see, let's comment this out. So how usually we do, we create an object reference, and then using the object reference, we call the method, right? That's how we did. Using the object reference, we can call the method. But now observe, what we can do here is we can pass the data here itself while creating the object, right? So here itself, while calling the method, we can actually invoke the constructor. So this is one main difference. Now see, what happens here when we how it is invoked is, so when we say employee emp equal to new employee, right? So new employee actually needs to create a new object in the memory. So while creating the object itself, we are passing the parameters. So JVM automatically understands that this is a constructor. So this is a constructor, and I have to pass these values to a constructor. So it know, and coming to here, so it will actually search for, is there any constructor? Constructor in the sense it can easily identify the method name same as the class name. So we do have one method, one such method here, right? So it actually passes these parameters here to this method, and class variables gets initialized with that. So as these are already initialized, so we can use the values in any other method. That's what we did here, right? So we don't need to call specifically the constructor, like uh, like how we do it for the user-defined method. So a user-defined method, like any other method, we need to create an object and use the object dot and then the method name to call that method, right? But constructor is invoked during object creation itself. We don't need to explicitly call the constructor. So this is very important. While calling the, while creating the object itself. So while creating the object itself, constructor is called. So implicitly, you don't even need to say that I'm calling this method, right? So you just need to create an object. During the object creation, the constructor might take the parameters or not. So if it is not taking parameters, you can define another constructor, something like this, which is constructor overloading, which we'll discuss in a few minutes. So you can have another constructor like this and have something displayed here, or write some logic here, right? So in that case, if you don't have any parameters here, that constructor will be called. So it will just verify if there is any constructor which is taking no parameters. Yeah, this is the method. Then this will be called. Or else, if it has any parameters, then it will search for constructor which is accepting any parameters. Then that constructor will be called. So that's how the constructors work, right? So create constructor employee. Yeah, we created, right? It's there. So it's there, and then we are passing the values to the constructor this way. So remember, we don't need to invoke constructor explicitly using the object reference. While creating the object itself, constructor is called implicitly. Implicitly in the sense, automatically the constructor is called. As it is anyway called automatically while object creation, we are taking it as an advantage and passing the parameters or values to it, so that even this initialization will be done, right, automatically in one step, right? So this is how the constructor works, and why we are doing this. And remember, constructor is mainly used to initialize the class variables. The main purpose of constructor is to initialize the class members. So and that we are doing it here, right? So we are passing the parameters to the constructor and initializing the class variables. Now let us see. Yeah, we can see the data here, right? So how did we get this data here? We pass it this data, and this actually called this constructor, and it actually, from here, the story is same like any other method. So the values have been passed to these parameters, and inside the class, inside the method, or inside the constructor, whatever logic you have written will get executed. Here we have actually initialized these variables. Initialize in the sense, the initial value we are passing it. So that we are passing it using the value which was actually got into these parameters using the method call, right? So that we are assigning or initializing to this class variables. So these class variables have the data now, and that can be used any other method. So we are calling display emp data, which we already created, where we are actually using this class variables, right? So that's how it works. This is a So that's how the constructor works. Is that clear? Is this clear? Constructor concept, very important one. Am I audible? Right? Okay. Is this concept clear? So we can pass the data using the constructor as well. So constructor is like any other method, but the method name has to be the same as class name, and constructor will not have any return type, not even void. And constructor, we don't need to explicitly call it using the object name. During the object creation itself, so constructor will be invoked or called automatically or implicitly, right? And constructors are mainly used to initialize the class variables. These are all the characteristics of the constructor. So it's always a best practice to use the constructor to initialize the variables. So if you have a complex logic, then you can better define a user-defined method and have your complex logic written there. But within the constructor, though it looks like similar like a method, so the main purpose of a constructor is to initialize the class variables. Hope it is clear. Okay, so now we will see another example on the constructors. I'll have some two variables defined here. Say for example, I have two integers, x and y. So whenever we create an object, while creating an object, so what do we do? Like in the main method, we actually do it something like this, right? New constructor example, right? So if you observe, here also a constructor is getting called, constructor example, which takes no parameters, right? So that this we call it as a default constructor. So even though you don't see it here, so it's there, right? So it is invisible, but it is there, which will be called. And whatever definition within that constructor has, that will be executed. We can even override that method, override that constructor. So this is a default constructor, right? So I'll just copy it here and we can use it like this as well. So this we call it as default constructor, right? So this is the default constructor. So once we actually create an object, so this will be called. You don't even need to call it explicitly, like using C dot, C is an object, right? C dot constructor example. You don't need to do that. So it's implicitly called while creating the object itself, right? So, and it actually calls a default constructor because default constructor will not take any parameters. And return type, anyway, constructor will not have any return type. So we don't need to specify it. So whenever we are talking about constructor, we just need to specify the parameters. We just need to think of the parameters, right? So in this example, like the default constructor will not take any, usually the default constructor means the constructor takes no parameters. So any object, like while we are creating, this is the syntax of creating an object, right? So while this is done, a new object is created and at the same time, the constructor, default constructor will be called, right? So what's the purpose of a constructor? So it is to initialize the values, initialize the class variables, right? So we can initialize it like this. X and Y are the class variables and we are using this default constructor also to initialize the values to those class variables, right? We can use it something like this. And then what we wanted to do, we actually passed it and then we wanted to actually create a method where we wanted to find the addition of these two numbers or sum of these two numbers. So return x plus y. We wanted to do sum of x and y and return this. So if you observe, we are returning something, right? So this is the reason it is erroring out. So the sum method, what it does, it is saying return type for the method is nothing. Yes, as we are returning some value, so we definitely need to specify the value return type for this method because it is any other user-defined method, right? It's not a constructor. So we need to definitely specify the return type. As we are returning x plus y, which are both are integers, then this integer. So we need to actually specify the return type as integer, right? Now, as this is an integer, like, so I wanted to call this method sum, right? Sum, fine, but it is returning something, right? So I'll capture this into some variable. It's the addition, right? Addition of two numbers. Or, or you can just say sum of the numbers is this, right? So what did we do here? We created a class called constructor example, and then the only new thing we did was default constructor, right? So default constructor, this anyway will be called implicitly, but we can even override that. Like if we wanted to define 8, so we can actually override it. This we call it as default constructor. So constructor will have the same name as class name. You can see it here. And this is like a normal method. So we are using braces and it is taking no parameters because this we call it as default constructor. Default constructor will not accept any parameters. And as per the constructor purpose, we are initializing the class variables with some values. And those values, we are using it in some other method. So we created a user-defined method again called sum, and we are using those variables here to write some logic. And it is returning something, so we are specifying the return type for this method. All right, now this is fine. The constructor is invoked or called during the object creation. So when we call new constructor example, automatically an object is created in the memory, and then at the same time, like the default constructor will also be called, right? And then the object reference will be captured into this object, constructor example object, right? So three things happens. An object gets created in memory because we are specifying new keyword. And as we do have a default constructor, even if you do not specify also, a default constructor will be called, right? Which will have no definition. But we are actually we are overriding it, right? So we are wanted to have our own definition. This is the reason we have written like this. So this constructor will be called the default constructor, and also the object reference will be copied into this variable called C. So three things happen. So we need to remember that. Now, like any other method, we wanted to call the sum method. As the sum method is returning something, we wanted to capture it. We captured it and we are displaying it on the console. Let's verify it now. So you can see some of the numbers is 300, correct, right? All right. So this was like with the default constructor, right? Now I wanted to actually pass this as a, you know, during the object creation itself. So I don't wanted to pass it something like this through the default constructor, but what I wanted to do is I'm gonna create an object here and pass the parameters to the constructor here like this. So is this possible? Yes. So if you see the constructor example increment is undefined. And you can see the fixes as also. So you do have some arguments, just remove this so that it matches the existing default constructor is what it is saying. And it is saying change constructor, add parameter. So change this constructor is what it is saying. And also we do have another fix, create constructor example. So I'm not gonna remove these parameters. I'm not gonna change my existing constructor definition, but I'm gonna create a new constructor with these parameters. So you can see this is what we did. For now, you can remove this. So you can see we are passing the parameters to this constructor, and then we can assign the values to it like this. So what happens now? When we are creating the object itself, we are passing the parameters. So what JVM does, it actually verifies is there constructor example. So is there a constructor which actually takes two parameters. So it will see here. So the first one, it's a default constructor which is not taking parameters. So this will not be called. And we do have another method or another constructor which is accepting two parameters which are integers. So this will be called. So these values will be copied here. And then as per the purpose of the constructor, we are using these values to initialize the class variables x and y, right? And again, once we do this, we wanted to have the sum. you can either capture that into a separate integer value and then print it, or you can do it in one go, like system.out.println, and you can just print the sum here. Sum 300, correct? Right? So if you observe, we did not comment it out the default constructor, but still JVM was able to identify it has to call this. So that's because of the parameters we pass, right? So this is what we call it as a constructor overloading. So it's part of the method overloading concept. So method overloading is having same name. So with the same name, we can have multiple methods. So that we'll discuss in the next session. But for now, you can think it of like, so we use that overloading concept for constructor here, right? So we have two methods. In fact, these are constructors. So they had the same name as the class name, right? But they differ in parameters. So anyway, both will not have return type, as that's a constructor. So it has to differ only by the parameters, right? So the first constructor is not taking any parameters, which we call it as a default constructor. And the second constructor, in our case, it is accepting two parameters, right? So when we actually write this statement, JVM actually searches for a constructor which accepts two parameters. So it will not consider this constructor as it is not taking parameters. So it finds this constructor which is accepting two parameters, and it executes this code which is written in it. So once that is done, an object reference will also be, we'll have the object reference also in this object called CE, and we are using that to call the method. Use another user defined method, right? So this is about constructor overloading. Is that clear? All right. Now we will see the differences. We'll see the difference between a method and a constructor. Whatever we have learned just now, so we'll see the differences. We'll compare method and a constructor. So if you see, method is used for specifying a simple or complex logic. So when we define a method, we write a method, user-defined method, when we wanted to write some logic inside it. It could be a simple logic or it could be a complex logic. But we create a method for writing the logic, simple or complex logic. And when we use the constructor, so we use the constructor to initialize the values of the class variables, right? So the purpose of the constructor itself is to initialize the values of the variables. So we use constructor to initialize the values of the variables. Next, method name can be anything, except it cannot have the same name as the class, because it is reserved and reserved for constructors, right? So, but other than that, method name can be anything. It could be any ABC, XYZ, right? So it could be anything, but constructor name should be same as the class name. Constructor name should be same as the class name. And method must have a return type. At least it should have void in case of if it is nothing is written, right? If nothing is written, when we are defining a method, if nothing is written, then we specify its return type as void. But coming to constructor, constructors does not have a return type. Will never return a value. So it will not have a return type. So we don't even need to specify a keyword called void. So that's the difference. And next, method can take parameters or arguments. Constructor can also take parameters and arguments. So this is optional. So constructor can take 0 or more parameters, right? Same for applicable for method. So this is similarity. This is not the actual difference, but this we can say it as similarity, right? So both method and constructor can take 0 or more parameters, right? And then we have to invoke or call the methods explicitly through object. For a method, how do we do? Like we create an object for the class, and then using that object, we can call the method defined within that class. Like object dot method name is what we do to call the method, right? So that's how we call the user defined method. But constructor is automatically invoked at the time of object creation. So when we create the object, we do have some syntax, right? So class name, object name equal to new class name, right? So at that time itself, the constructor gets invoked automatically. We don't need to explicitly call the constructor using the object name, like how we do it for the method. So it is automatically, or we call it as implicitly invoked at the time of object creation. That's the property of constructor. Very important. And method can be called any number of times, right? Method can be called any number of times. Say, for example, I wanted to have the sum of 120 in our last example, right? So what I can do, I can call it as 100 comma 20, 100 comma 200, right? So in the same way, like if I wanted to have to calculate sum of 300 and 400, I can call it again and again, right? Same method, user defined method, we can call it a n number of times. But constructor is usually called once during object creation. So because the purpose of constructor itself is to initialize the variables, right? So we initialize the variables only once. So that's the reason, like the constructor is usually called only once during the object creation. So these are the differences between a method and a constructor. Now we'll see like why constructor has no return type and why the constructor should have the same name as class name. So constructor, there is no return type because constructors do not have a return type. So because they are designed to initialize new objects, right? So and the new keyword implicitly returns the new object. Anyway, it is returning the new object. We know it is returning the new object, right? So we don't need to actually have the return type for it. Every time it will create a new object. We know that, right? So as it is anyway implicit, we don't need to actually, have the return type for the constructor. So this is mainly used for to initialize the values, right? So using the new keyword while creating the object itself. So what happens? A new object gets created, right? So we are using the same class name to create the constructor, to call the constructor, because so it implicitly returns the anyway new object. So it always returns the new object. We know that it is gonna return the new object. So that's the reason we don't need to specify the return type for the constructor. It's always anyway new object will be returned, right? So we don't need to specify the return type for the constructor. Now, why do it have the same name as class? So we wanted to clearly associate them with the class they initialize. So mainly constructors are used to initialize the values, right? So we wanted to clearly associate them with the class they initialize and to ensure they are automatically called during object creation. So we don't want it to call it explicitly, right? So during the object creation itself, so how do we create the object? New of class name. Only then we create the object, right? So new of class name. This is the reason. So during the object creation itself, we wanted to call the constructor. So this is the reason we do have the constructor name same as the class name. So this also enhances readability, even the consistency, and it will have clarity. So when we are writing the Java program, we will have that clarity, right? We'll also have that readability because like once you see this through your class, so it will be very clear that if you have the same name as the class name, so anyone can easily know that that's a constructor and that's used for initializing the values, right? So for more readability. So that was the reason. And also, we wanted to invoke the constructor during object creation itself. So object creation happens using the new keyword. So this new and then class name. So this is the reason we had the class constructor name same as the class name. And return type, we don't have it because anyway it is going to return an object. Right? So this is the reason we don't have the return type and the constructor name is same as the class name. Any questions? Is that clear? All right, I'm going to stop here. So in this session, we have learned like methods. So what is a method? What are the different method types we have? What are all the different combinations we have covered it? We have seen each with an example, and we have related those with the actual built-in methods which we have already know, which we have learned. and how we can actually pass the data to the variables, class variables. So the three ways: using object reference variable, which you already know, and using the user defined method, we can pass the data to the variables, and also we can use the constructor to pass the data to the variables. And we have seen like how to overload the constructor. Like the same constructor is having the is any constructor is same like any other method, having except having the name as a class name, right? So we have seen the same like same method repeat like more than one constructor in a class, which actually differs by the parameter it accepts. That's called constructor overloading. We have seen an example on that as well. And finally, we understood the differences between method and constructor. And we have seen like why why there is no return type for the constructor, and why the name is same as the class name for the constructor, right? So this is all we discussed in this session. Now I'm stopping here. If you have any questions, you can ask.